Hi, in today's lesson we're going to be talking about how to find domain and range if we have context or some sort of story and not just a graph. So let's go ahead and get started. Just to quickly review, remember that domain stands for the x values and range stands for the y values. Now, if my problem does not include the variables x and y, remember x stands for the input values and y stands for the output values. So if there's no x and y, what I need to figure out is what input values do I have for the domain and what output values do I have for the range. If I read this problem, it says, a construction crew is lengthening the road. Let L be the total length of the road in miles and D be the number of days that the construction crew has worked. Suppose that L equals 4D plus 400 gives L as a function of D, and the construction crew can work at most 90 days. So it says identify the description of the values in the domain and range of the function, and then for each, choose the most appropriate set. So first off, I want to decide for the domain, big D, what variable represents the input? The input. Now, if I look at an equation, the input is always going to be given away to me. It's whatever I put in to my equation. My output is whatever my equation equals. So this is the input, this is the output. So for domain, I'm going to use the variable D. Now, as I look at my input, which is D, which stands for days, the very first question I have to ask myself is this discrete or is this continuous? Now, the days that a crew has worked on it, they can work half a day or a quarter of a day or an eighth of a day. So D is continuous. So when I write my domain, I'm going to put D in the middle for number of days because that's my variable. Now, what's the smallest number of days that this crew can work? Well, they could work a minimum of 0 days. They could say, I'm not going to work on it at all. What's the maximum number of days? Well, here at the end it says that the maximum number of days is 90. So I put 90 over here. And remember, my inequality notation says, that since 0 is the least and 90 is the greatest, I'm going to have my alligator mouse pointing towards the 90. So the days must be between 0 and 90 days. Now let's determine our range. Now, what variable is my range? Remember, the range stands for my output. So if traditionally it's y, but in this equation I don't see a y, but remember my output stands on its own, so it's this L. So I'm going to erase the y and put a capital L in its place. And then I'm going to say, okay, what are the possible outputs for this equation? Now, here's the thing, you can always find the possible outputs by plugging them in. If the minimum number of days working is 0, plug a 0 in. 4 times 0 is 0 plus 400, so the minimum length is 400. That's the minimum. So I'm going to put minimum length of 400 over here. Well, now what's the maximum length? Well, the maximum length is if they work every single day. If they work every single day, that would be 90 days. So I'm going to input 90. 4 times 90 is 360. So what is 360 plus 400? Well, that's 760. Remember my inequality signs? Face towards the larger of the two numbers. So my domain is the days between 0 and 90, and my range is the length between 400 and 760. And we're just going to forget about the graph on this example. Okay, now let's look at this next example. It says the function y equals 12.9x represents the cost y of x admission tickets for the museum. Graph the function using the domain of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Is the domain discrete or continuous? Now remember to look at the inputs to decide if something is discrete or continuous. If my input is the number of admission tickets, can I buy half an admission ticket? And if the answer is no, then this is going to be discrete. So if I want to list the domain, okay, so it's telling me what domain I want to use. Because this is not continuous, I don't want to do the inequality notation. That's not gonna, I don't want all the values in between. I'm just gonna list the numbers. So I can buy 0 tickets, 1 ticket, 2 ticket, 3 ticket, or 4 tickets based on this right here. Now, how do I find my range? Well, I just plug in my numbers. If I bought 0 tickets, plug it in, I pay $0. If I buy 1 ticket, I spend $12.90. If I buy 2 tickets, I spend $25.80. If I buy 3 tickets, and so on. I don't have a calculator in front of me, but you get the idea. So I'm going to list all of those values. All right, last example. So let's go ahead and read the problem all the way through, and then we can determine what variables we want to use for the domain and the range. So the fuel tank of a certain airplane can hold up to 200 gallons of fuel. Let W be the total weight of the airplane in pounds, and let F be the total amount of fuel in its tank in gallons. Suppose that W equals 5F plus 300 gives W as a function of F. So we want to identify the correct description of the values in both the domain and the range, and then choose the appropriate set of values. So what does that mean? Decide what variable we want to use for domain, decide what variable we want to use for range, and then decide what those values are. So for domain, remember domain stands for the input. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look at my equation and find the variable that represents my input. So in my equation, 5F plus 300, okay, the input is the F. So I'm going to use F as my variable that I'm going to put in the middle of my inequalities. Okay, I know that this is going to be a continuous function because F is the total amount of fuel in the tank in gallons, and gallons is something that I measure. So remember, continuous things are things that I measure. So what is the minimum amount of fuel that I can put into this airplane? Well, the minimum amount of fuel that I can put into any airplane is 0. So my minimum is 0, and it can equal 0, so I want to make sure I put the or equal to sign. What's the maximum? Well, it says right here at the beginning that it can hold up to 200 gallons of fuel. So my maximum is equal to or less than 200. So I have my inequality for my domain. Now let's look at our range inequality. Remember, that is my output. So what variable stands for my output? Whatever my equation rule is equal to. So I'm going to use the variable W. And how do I find the minimum and the maximum? Well, I'm going to have to refer to my domain's, my input. What is the minimum amount of fuel I can have? What's the maximum amount of fuel that I can have? And that's going to help me determine the weight, which is what W stands for. So if I plug in my minimum amount of fuel, 5 times 0 is 0, plus 3,000. So the minimum weight of my airplane is 3,000 pounds. Okay. What's the maximum amount? Well, the maximum amount is if I put the maximum amount of fuel in. So if I plug in a 200, okay, 5 times 200 is 1,000. What's 1,000 plus 3,000? We have 4,000. So the maximum weight of my airplane with just its fuel can be 4,000. These are going to be my domains and my ranges, and I'm done. Hey, if you have any questions, please send me an email or I'll answer questions tomorrow in class, and have a great day.